May 16th, 2006. Baltimore, Maryland. 32-year-old Rey Rivera receives a phone call which compels him to race out of his house and drive away before he goes missing. 8 days later, Rey's partially decomposed body is discovered inside a locked conference room at the Belvedere Hotel. Since there is a hole in the ceiling, police conclude that Rey jumped off the main roof of the 14-story building and his death was a suicide. However, Rey's loved ones discover some odd discrepancies, which make them believe it would have been impossible for Rey's body to land at the location, and they suspect foul play. They also think that Rey's workplace may have been complicit in his death, but the exact circumstances of what happened to him remain shrouded in mystery. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we're going to be exploring a pretty big case today, the unexplained 2006 death of Rey Rivera. As you probably know, this case was the subject of the very first episode, titled Mystery on the Rooftop, from the new version of Unsolved Mysteries, which launched on Netflix on July the 1st. And not surprisingly, during the past month since it was released, I have probably received more requests to cover this story than any other case in the history of this podcast. Well, given that the backbone of this show is exploring cases which were featured on the classic original version of Unsolved Mysteries, you just knew that I would be tackling some of the cases from this new version. Anyway, the death of Rey Rivera was definitely an ideal choice to be the subject of this reboot's debut episode because it's a very compelling mystery which, on the surface, does not seem to have an explanation which makes 100% complete sense. After he inexplicably left his house and went missing for over a week, Rey's body was discovered inside a conference room at Baltimore's historic Belvedere Hotel, and the evidence suggested that he had crashed through the roof after a fall from a very high place. The police ruled that Rey's death was a suicide, but not only did his wife and family dispute the notion that Rey was suicidal, they could not even figure out where he might have jumped from to begin with, as the main roof of the Belvedere Hotel was very difficult to access, and the spot where he supposedly landed was over 40 feet away from the edge. Of course, Unsolved Mysteries pushed forward the idea that an investment research firm Rey had worked for, which happened to be owned by one of his best friends, might have been involved in his death. But there were also a lot of key details about this case not mentioned in the Unsolved Mysteries episode, so I will often be making reference to a book titled An Unexplained Death, The True Story of a Body at the Belvedere. The book was authored by Makita Brotman, who lived at the Belvedere at the time of Rey's death, and it contains a lot of additional information about what I believe is a very complex story, so this will be one of the most in-depth episodes we've ever done. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the unexplained death of Rey Rivera. Our story begins in Baltimore, Maryland in 2006. Our central figure is 32-year-old Rey Rivera, who lives with his 36-year-old wife, Allison Jones Rivera. The couple have been married for 6 months, after having their wedding in Puerto Rico, Rey's original birthplace, and they'd been living together at a house in Baltimore's original Northwood neighborhood since December of 2004. They had previously lived in California, as Rey always had aspirations of becoming a screenwriter and director in Hollywood, but after failing to attain financial success in the industry, Rey was approached by one of his closest friends, Frank Porter Stansberry, who goes by the name Porter. Porter runs a firm called Stansberry & Associates Investment Research, which is situated in Baltimore and is one of the many subsidiary companies for Agora Incorporated. After initially convincing Rey to move to Baltimore for a month in order to help him with a company project, Porter became impressed enough by Rey's work that he offered him a full-time position writing a financial newsletter called The Rebound Report. During this time, Rey and Allison had been maintaining a long-distance relationship while she stayed in California, but she ultimately decided to move to Baltimore with him, and Rey's steady employment would earn them enough money to finally get married. Rey eventually chose to resign from his full-time position at Stansberry in order to do freelance contract work for the Oxford Club, another subsidiary company of Agora Incorporated, and his responsibilities would involve filming, editing, and producing videos of conferences. By this point, Rey and Allison have put their house on the market because they are planning to return to California sometime in the near future. Rey is going to continue pursuing a filmmaking career as he has just started up his own video production company called Saba Productions and completed a new feature-length screenplay. On Tuesday, May the 16th, Allison was in Richmond, Virginia on a business trip while Rey remained in Baltimore, and a work colleague of Allison's named Claudia was staying at the residence as a house guest. When Allison returned to her hotel that evening, she attempted to call Rey on his cell phone multiple times, but received no answer. Allison then decided to call Claudia on her cell phone to ask if Rey was at the house, but she received a surprising story. According to Claudia, at around 6:30 p.m., she overheard Rey receive a phone call in his upstairs office from an unknown party. The call was very brief, and the only thing she could hear Rey say was an expletive before he immediately ran down the stairs out the back door. Claudia then heard Rey briefly return to the house a few minutes later, possibly because he had forgotten something, but he left again in Allison's SUV, and this would turn out to be the last time he was seen alive. When Rey failed to resurface by the following morning, and Allison was still unable to reach him on his phone, she immediately returned to Baltimore and discovered that both Rey and her SUV were still missing from the house. Allison noticed that an open soda can and a bag of potato chips had been left out in the kitchen, and the bedroom and office lights, as well as Rey's computer, were left on. At the time, Rey was editing together a video of a recent conference he had filmed for the Oxford Club. Since a deadline was looming, Allison was very perturbed that Rey was nowhere to be found, so she soon reported him missing to the Baltimore Police Department. When their family and friends were notified about Rey's disappearance, many of them would travel to Baltimore to assist with the search effort and canvass the city with missing persons flyers. Porter Stansberry would offer a $1,000 reward for information leading to Rey's safe return, which he eventually increased to $5,000. On the afternoon of May the 22nd, Allison's parents were driving through the Mount Vernon section of downtown Baltimore when they noticed Allison's SUV in a parking lot on St. Paul Street. There was a ticket on the SUV which had been placed there by the parking attendant when he arrived for work on the morning of May the 17th. Since the attendant had gone home at 6 p.m. the previous evening, this seemed to indicate that the SUV was parked in the lot shortly after Rey was seen leaving his house on the 16th, but there was still no sign of him. The lot was in fairly close proximity to Rey's workplace, though he rarely visited the office anymore, since he now did most of his work from home. On May the 24th, some of Rey's co-workers from the Oxford Club were out on their lunch break and had heard about the discovery of the SUV, so they decided to perform their own search for clues inside a nearby parking garage. The garage was adjacent to the south wing of the Belvedere Hotel, an historic structure which had originally opened in 1903, though it would be converted from a hotel into a complex for condominiums in 1991. Rey's co-workers made their way to the parking structure's exterior upper level and soon noticed a hole in the Belvedere Hotel's lower annex roof. The hole was about 40 inches in diameter, and it also appeared that a pair of flip-flops, a cell phone, and a pair of glasses were resting beside it. This prompted the co-workers to contact the police, and when they arrived at the Belvedere, they learned that the hole was located on the roof of a vacant second-floor conference room which had once been a swimming area. When the staff let the police inside the locked room, they were shocked to discover a hole in the ceiling and Rey Rivera's partially decomposed body on the floor. Due to the level of decomposition, it was impossible to determine Rey's exact time of death, though it was believed that he had been dead for at least a week before he was found. The autopsy would reveal that Rey had a number of serious injuries, including a fractured skull, a total of 24 broken ribs which had punctured his heart and lungs, 2 different breaks in his lower right leg, as well as a number of lacerations, cuts, and bruises. Toxicology tests would show no traces of drugs in Rey's system, and while there was a small amount of alcohol, it could have been produced during the process of decomposition. Since the injuries seemed to be consistent with a fall from a high place, the Baltimore PD concluded that Rey's death was a probable suicide and that he had leaped off the main 14th-story roof of the Belvedere before plummeting nearly 200 feet and crashing through the lower annex roof of the second-floor conference room. However, Rey's wife and family had issues with this theory, as they maintained that Rey had never shown any signs of being depressed or suicidal. In fact, both he and Allison had booked a trip to New Mexico, which was scheduled to take place a few weeks after he went missing, and he had told Allison that he wanted to have children and start a family. On the same day he disappeared, Rey also booked an editing suite for the upcoming weekend, which he was planning to use to finish his video of the conference he had filmed for the Oxford Club. In addition, Rey was known for being afraid of heights, so his loved ones believed that even if he was feeling suicidal, he would not have chosen to end his life by jumping off a tall building. There was also skepticism about whether it was physically possible for Rey to have leaped off the Belvedere's main roof and landed at the spot where he did, as the hole on the lower annex roof was located 43 feet from the edge. If Rey's death was a suicide, he likely would have had to make a running jump while traveling at a speed of 11 miles per hour, even though the roof was only about 40 feet in diameter, and Rey would need to make the sprint while wearing flip-flops, which, as you recall, were found on the lower annex roof near the hole. One alternate theory was that Rey could have jumped off the upper level of the adjacent parking garage, where his co-workers first noticed the hole. However, it was only a 20-foot drop from the parking garage to the conference room, which did not seem high enough to have caused the severe injuries on Rey's body. The hole was also 20 feet away from the parking structure, and since the upper level was surrounded by a 4-foot wall on all sides, it seemed unlikely that Rey would have been able to get a running start and leap that far. Another possibility was that Rey could have landed in that exact spot and sustained those injuries if he climbed onto an outside ledge located above the conference room on the 11th floor and jumped from there. But the problem is that the only way to access the ledge would have been to climb out through one of the building's windows, which only opened about halfway, and these windows would have been inside an office or someone's private residence, and there was no indication that Rey could have accessed any of these rooms. In fact, this was one of the most baffling aspects of the case. Not only were there no eyewitnesses who saw Rey's death, but there wasn't anyone who could recall seeing him in the Belvedere at all during that time period, even though he was a pretty distinct-looking figure at over 6'5" and 250 pounds. According to the Belvedere's management, while attempting to retrieve possible data from a hard drive containing video surveillance footage, there was a technical problem, and some of it was erased. Nonetheless, they did provide the hard drive to the police, and when it was later returned to the Belvedere, the concierge invited Allison to watch it with him. It turned out that there was no existing surveillance footage from May the 16th, and therefore, no confirmed sightings of Rey, and the one security camera which overlooked the main rooftop just happened to be disconnected that night. In addition, the Belvedere's roof was out of bounds for the building's residents and very difficult to access, as it required climbing up a ladder located in an attic. The only 2 doors to this attic were located in the back of a nightclub called the 13th floor, and a service area next to the kitchens on the 12th floor. There was skepticism about whether Rey would have had enough familiarity with the Belvedere's layout to navigate his way through the building, find these doors, and make it to the roof without attracting any attention, and that's assuming the doors were even unlocked that night to begin with. Another weird anomaly with the case was the discovery of Rey's eyeglasses and cell phone next to the hole in the conference room roof. Even though Rey had supposedly fallen 200 feet to his death and suffered serious injuries, both items were relatively undamaged, as there were no scratches on the glasses and the phone had no cracks on the screen and was still functional. And while one of Rey's flip-flops had a broken strap, the other one was still intact, though it appeared to have scuff marks. However, the thing which stuck out the most to Allison was an item which wasn't found. At their wedding, Allison had bought Rey an antique money clip which had his initials engraved on it as a gift. But even though Rey always carried it on him, and many of his other personal possessions, such as his keys, driver's license, and credit card, were found with his body, the money clip could not be found anywhere following his death. Dr. Melissa Brazel, the assistant state medical examiner who conducted Rey's autopsy, did believe that most of his injuries were consistent with a fall from a great height, but in the end, she did not think there was enough evidence to conclusively support a homicide or suicide ruling. She wrote in the official autopsy report, quote, "Because the circumstances surrounding the incident are unclear, and it is not known how the deceased came to have participated from such a height, the manner of death is best classified as undetermined." End quote. This meant that the Baltimore PD would technically have to keep the case open, but according to Allison, Dr. Brazel told her, quote, "I know what they're trying to do, but we're not closing the case." During her Unsolved Mysteries interview, Allison claimed that the one detail Brazel believed was not consistent with a fall was the way in which Rey's shins were broken. However, the actual autopsy report is available online, and it seems to contradict this, as it shows that only Rey's lower right leg was broken, not both of them. Regardless, the police still believed that a suicide had taken place, though one of their homicide detectives, Michael Baer, felt differently. Baer claimed that from the moment he saw Rey's personal items on the roof next to the hole, he got the impression that the scene had been staged, and someone may have put those items there after the fact. However, 3 weeks into the investigation, Baer would be reassigned and transferred off the case, as his superiors apparently believed he was spending too much time on a death, which they did not believe was foul play. After that, there would be no further movement from the police on the investigation. But the case continued to gnaw away at Baer even after his retirement from the force, and he would express his views during the Unsolved Mysteries episode. Anyway, Allison remembered that in the weeks prior to his death, Rey had exhibited some strange, uncharacteristic behavior as he became very protective of Allison and did not want her to go anywhere without him. 1 week before he went missing, Allison went running at a nearby track, and Rey insisted on going with her, even though Allison said it was not necessary. Since it was raining, Rey sat in his car while Allison jogged around the track until he noticed a man approaching her. This prompted Rey to frantically exit the vehicle and run towards the track, but while the man went off in another direction and nothing happened, Allison said the incident really seemed to shake Rey up. At around 1 a.m. on May the 15th, the day before Rey vanished, the couple was awakened at their house by the sound of the burglar alarm. Allison said this prompted Rey to immediately run downstairs with a baseball bat, and he looked to be more terrified than she'd ever seen him before. The Riveras did notify the police, who investigated the scene, but while Allison said one of the windows showed signs of being tampered with, the police were inclined to believe that squirrels had set off the alarm. During the early morning hours of May the 17th, after Rey went missing, their house guest Claudia was spending the night at the residence alone, and she claimed the alarm went off again at around 3 a.m. Before these two incidents, Allison claimed the alarm had never gone off the entire time they lived there. Following Rey's death, Allison would discover an odd typewritten note which was taped behind Rey's computer in his home office. It had been typed up in minuscule print and folded up in plastic alongside a blank check, which was drawn to Rey's newly formed company, Saba Productions. The note started out with the words, quote, Brothers and sisters around the world, volcanoes are erupting. What an awesome sight. Whom virtue unites, death will not separate." End quote. The note would contain the names of some prominent deceased figures from Hollywood, such as actor Christopher Reeve and director Stanley Kubrick, as well as the names of Rey's family members, friends, and other people he knew. He then wrote out a request that both himself and all the people he listed be made 5 years younger, and other things listed in the note included the titles of some of his favorite movies, some recent inventions and technologies, and a number of cryptic quotes. Some of them included, quote, "I stand before you as a man who understands the purpose and value of our secrets. That's why I cherish them as secrets. That was a well-played game. Congratulations to all who participated. And life is a test to see if you can control your spirit. Take care and enjoy the festivities." End quote. Allison was certain that Rey had typed out the note on the same day he disappeared because she found scraps from it in the trash can. Well, one of the opening lines, "Whom virtue unites, death will not separate," is a quote which is often used by the Freemasons, an organization which Rey always had a fascination with. In fact, hours before he went missing, Rey had actually gone to an appointment with a member of a Maryland Masonic lodge to inquire about the possibility of joining them, and he went to a bookstore to purchase a copy of Freemasons for Dummies. He had also recently started reading a book about Freemasonry called The Builders. Allison turned the note over to the police, who subsequently sent it to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. They did not believe the note was suicidal in nature, though they came to some other conclusions about it, which I'll be discussing later on. Rey was known for stream of consciousness writing, as he kept many journals of his thoughts, and while the note may have been along the same lines, there has been speculation that it may have been a secret code of some sort. The Baltimore PD did take a number of Rey's personal items from his office, including his computer, and kept them for 90 days before returning them to Allison, but they never told her if they found anything of significance. Anyway, attention would soon be turned towards Rey's friend, Porter Stansberry, who had a bit of a checkered history. In 2003, before Rey made the move to Baltimore, Stansberry and associates were investigated by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, aka the SEC, and hit with a lawsuit charging them with securities fraud. Stansberry had allegedly used their financial newsletters to disseminate false stock information and defraud potential investors, and they would eventually be found guilty of these offenses in Maryland District Federal Court. Stansberry would appeal the ruling, and the case remained tied up in litigation for years, before the firm was finally ordered to pay a fine of $1.5 million in restitution and civil penalties. It was speculated that one of the ulterior motives Porter might have had for hiring Rey to write a new financial newsletter for his firm was to help clean up his reputation. The newsletter was titled The Rebound Report because it focused on companies which hadn't been doing well but were on the rebound. By his own admission, Rey did not know all that much about finance, and he became troubled when some of the stocks he wrote about did not rebound as well as he had hoped. According to Allison, Rey became stressed out over the idea of providing bad financial advice to investors, which could potentially cause them to lose money, and this ultimately influenced his decision to leave his full-time position at Stansberry and do freelance work producing videos for the Oxford Club. On May the 14th, 2 days before Rey disappeared, Allison overheard him leaving a message for someone on his cell phone where he said, quote, "Hey man, call me back. I finally got it all figured out." At the time Rey went missing, Porter was out of town at a corporate retreat, but he would return to Baltimore to help search for him. During this time period, Porter revealed to Rey's family that Rey had left this message for him. He even played them the recording of the voicemail, but maintained that he had no idea what Rey was referring to when he said, "I finally got it all figured out." Following the discovery of Rey's body, Allison visited Porter at his office, where he informed her that he would not be cooperating with the police's inquiry into Rey's death because he felt he would be biased against him because of the SEC investigation. Phone records showed that Rey received a total of 5 calls from Magora Incorporated on the day he went missing, but there's been some dispute about the origin of the call which prompted him to sprint out of the house at 6:30 p.m. If you watch the Unsolved Mysteries episode, they make it sound like Rey received a call from a switchboard at Stansberry and Associates, and that it was impossible to determine which extension this call originated from. Of course, Rey was no longer working for Stansberry at this point, but for the Oxford Club, another subsidiary company of Agora. According to Makita Brotman's book, An Unexplained Death, Agora used a business line that diverted all their connections to a single number, and this was the origin of the final call to Rey. But in some of the earliest news coverage of this case, Colonel Fred Bielfeld, who would later become the Baltimore Police Commissioner, stated that this call originated from the Fells Point neighborhood, which is about 2 miles away from Mount Vernon, where all of Agora's offices are located. However, in recent news articles about the case in the Baltimore Sun, a police spokeswoman has confirmed that the call came from a quote-unquote owned subsidiary company of Agora Publishing. So yes, there's definitely some confusion about this call, but whatever the case, it does not sound like the actual caller ever came forward, and no one knows what they might have said which prompted Rey to react in this fashion. The Unsolved Mysteries episode also states that Stansberry and Associates placed a gag order on all of their employees in order to prevent them from speaking to the police about the case, but a crisis management firm recently hired by Agora have publicly denied these claims and maintained there was no gag order of any kind. In December of 2018, Makita Brotman published her aforementioned book about this case, titled An Unexplained Death, The True Story of a Body at the Belvedere, which seemingly drew the attention of Unsolved Mysteries. Only about a month after the book's release, Allison would be contacted by the producers of the show, who expressed their interest in featuring Rey's story on an episode of their new version of the series, which would be released on July the 1st, 2020. The exposure on Unsolved Mysteries has given new life to this story, and it has since become a heavily discussed case online, but the actual circumstances of Rey Rivera's death are still shrouded in mystery. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Anyway, before I delve into this case any further, I should talk a little about the newly relaunched version of Unsolved Mysteries, which is currently streaming on Netflix. At the time of this recording, they have released 6 episodes, and they are planning to drop 6 more new episodes sometime within the next few months. Judging from reactions I've seen online, I know that some people were disappointed over the fact that it had a totally different look and feel than the original Unsolved Mysteries, as there was no narrator or host to fill Robert Stack's shoes, and it came across more like your average modern true crime show rather than the classic series. And instead of their traditional format of featuring multiple segments per episode, the new series consists of only one case being covered over the course of a 40 to 50 minute episode. But the new format does work fairly well for many of the stories they selected, as it not only allows them to go more in depth into the cases, but also the backgrounds of the victims. I will definitely say that the death of Rey Rivera was the absolute perfect case to feature on their first episode, because I had never heard of it before and was left absolutely transfixed by the story. In fact, once it was over, I almost had to resist the urge to immediately start working on a Trail Went Cold episode. However, while it was much easier to accept Unsolved Mysteries segments at face value during the pre-internet world of the 1980s and 90s, it's now common knowledge that many true crime documentaries and shows are not always going to give you the full story. Ever since this episode came out, the knee-jerk reaction from a lot of people online is that Rey was the victim of some sort of elaborate murder conspiracy, and his so-called best friend, Porter Stansberry, was involved. In fact, if you type Porter Stansberry's name into YouTube, you'll find a number of older videos of him which are related to his work in finance and have nothing to do with this case, but their comment sections are now being spammed by people accusing him of being a murderer. And I get the sense that most of these comments were written by people who don't know that there's a lot more to this story than a 50-minute Netflix episode. I do acknowledge that one of the reasons this has turned out to be such a compelling mystery is because there really isn't an explanation which makes 100% complete sense and accounts for all the strange oddities. Even if you believe the official explanation that Rey's death was a suicide, there are still a number of unanswered questions about where Rey could have jumped from, how he reached that location to begin with, and how his body could have landed in the spot where it was found. But at the same time, if Rey was a victim of foul play, how exactly would that scenario have played out? As hard as it may be to believe that Rey was capable of making it to an inaccessible roof and jumping to a spot which was 40 feet away from the building, how exactly could other people have made it to the roof and thrown his body far enough to land at that spot? Well, I think the Unsolved Mysteries episode spent so much time covering the murder versus suicide angle that it did not explore the possibility that Rey's death may have been the result of some sort of unexplained mental breakdown. Rey's wife and family kept commenting that he had so much going for him in his life that he never would have considered suicide, which is something you'll often hear a victim's loved ones say whenever they die under strange circumstances like this. However, this doesn't change the fact that people who have shown no obvious signs of being suicidal will sometimes choose to end their own life without any warning whatsoever, taking everyone by complete surprise. One can just never know what's really going on inside a suicidal person's head. Yes, on the surface, even if Rey had made the decision to end it all, it doesn't make much sense for him to go to the trouble of making his way to the rooftop of a labyrinthian 14-story building rather than doing something a lot simpler like jumping off a bridge. But suicidal people can make odd choices like that, which could make perfect sense in their own minds. I reference this case a lot, but I've always looked at suicides in a much different light ever since I watched one of the earliest missing persons cases ever featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the disappearance of Gail Delano. Here was a woman who vanished from her home state of Maine in what initially seemed like an abduction, but it would later turn out that she had traveled over 1,500 miles to Mobile, Alabama, checked into a hotel under a fake name, and overdosed on pills. At the time the Unsolved Mysteries segment was filmed, I'm sure that no one from Gail's family had any inkling that she was currently an unidentified Jane Doe in another state. Now, unlike Rey Rivera, Gail Delano had a documented history of clinical depression, but it's not like anyone ever anticipated that she would travel such a great distance just to take her own life. Yet in her own mind, she probably had her reasons for doing so, just as Rey might have had his own reasons for traveling to the Belvedere to jump off the roof. I did find it odd how many people interviewed during the Unsolved Mysteries episode stated that Rey had no history of psychological problems, but then they start describing some instances of Rey displaying paranoid behavior shortly before his death. In fact, the episode doesn't even mention the weird incident where Rey freaked out over seeing another man approach Allison while she was jogging on the track, or the fact that he became super protective of his wife and insisted on accompanying her everywhere. Well, this behavior could be seen as a sign that Rey believed their lives were in danger, and may have also been a sign of possible mental health issues. Well, this is one of the angles which is explored by Makita Brotman's book, An Unexplained Death, The True Story of a Body at the Belvedere. It must be noted that Brotman is not a professional investigator, and that the book is pretty much the story of how she became an amateur sleuth because someone just happened to die under strange circumstances at the building where she was living. But I think it's a valuable source of information because Brotman was, and I believe still is, a resident of the Belvedere, so she has a lot of knowledge and insight about the building's layout, as well as some first-hand accounts of what the scene was like on the day Rey's body was discovered. And of course, the book contains a lot of information not mentioned on Unsolved Mysteries. The narrative which has often been put forward is that no one saw or heard anything unusual at the Belvedere on the night Rey originally went missing, but according to Brotman, she heard a very loud noise at around 10 p.m. that night while she was inside her bedroom, which caused the windows to shake in their frames. When Brotman looked outside the windows, she saw nothing, but for all we know, she may have heard the sound of Rey plummeting off the roof, which would pinpoint his exact time of death. Interestingly enough, Brotman recently did an AMA on Reddit, in which she claimed that she was interviewed for nearly 3 hours for the Unsolved Mysteries episode but they did not use any of her footage. And even though the book was the primary source for a lot of the information shared on the show, they never made any reference to it or her. Well, the cynical side of me thinks this was done for fear that it would make the story seem less mysterious. The Unsolved Mysteries episode features interviews with a number of people who support the idea that Rey may have been the victim of foul play, including Amy Rivera, Rey's brother, Angel, Michael Bayer, the Baltimore PD homicide detective who was transferred off the case, as well as Jane Miller and Stephen Janis, two investigative journalists who have always believed there was something fishy about this case. But do you know who does not believe Rey was the victim of foul play? Makita Brotman. At the end of her book, she reaches the conclusion that in spite of all these oddities, she does not find it likely that anyone else was involved in Rey's death, and believes that he jumped off the roof while experiencing an episode of psychosis. Brotman hesitates on calling it a suicide per se, since in his own mind, Rey may not have believed he was taking his own life. Like I mentioned earlier, Brotman is not a professional investigator, but she is a certified psychoanalyst. We're going to talk more about the cryptic note found taped behind Rey's computer a little later, but as you might recall, it was sent to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, who concluded that the note did not appear to be suicidal in nature. While their entire report about the note is available for viewing online, and while certain sections have been redacted, they did state their belief that the writing in the note was consistent from someone who might have been suffering from persecutory delusional disorder, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. Of course, as far as I know, Rey was never officially diagnosed with any of these disorders, so I'm not going to say with any certainty that they played a role in his death. However, one passage of the FBI report states, quote, "Persons with delusional disorder can be highly functional in many areas of their life. In this particular case, the mental illness suffered by the author of the letter may go virtually undetected by family, friends, and coworkers," end quote. So it's entirely possible that Rey was suffering from some sort of psychosis which no one else was aware of. In fact, near the end of the report, one of the recommendations is that Rey's family members be re-interviewed regarding his mental health. And here's one more interesting quote from the report. Quote, "Rivera made a comment in the presence of others that he believed the Church of Scientology ran the West Coast film industry and the Masons ran the East Coast film industry." End quote. Well, Rey's note contained a Freemason quote, and he purchased a book about Freemasonry and inquired about joining one of their lodges on the very same day he went missing, so could that have had any relevance to what happened to him? It's also interesting how the note contained the line, quote, "That was a well-played game," which may have some relevance to a theory about this case, which has since gained a lot of traction online. Almost immediately after the Unsolved Mysteries episode came out, a poster under the username Zoomalight Blue started a thread on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit I always frequent, and presented a very intriguing theory that Rey's death may have been inspired by the movie, The Game. While the Unsolved Mysteries episode never made any direct reference to it, if you look closely at the list of films from Rey's note, The Game is mentioned. In case you've never seen it, The Game is a David Fincher-directed film which came out in 1997 and stars Michael Douglas as Nicholas Van Orton, a wealthy but cold-hearted investment banker who was given a strange birthday gift by his younger brother, Conrad, played by Sean Penn. Nicholas is signed up to participate in a quote-unquote game presented by a shadowy company who will put him through a series of odd challenges that supposedly add excitement to his life. But after a while, Nicholas begins to believe that the people behind this company are attempting to destroy his life and steal all his money before they kill him. Spoiler alert, though I guess that shouldn't be necessary since the movie is over 20 years old, but at the very end, Nicholas finds himself in a position where he feels compelled to end his life by jumping off the roof of a tall building, but he winds up crashing through a fake glass ceiling and landing on a giant air mattress. It turns out that this whole game was an elaborate setup orchestrated by Nicholas's brother, Conrad, and everyone else in his life, but it was done in a positive way. Conrad believed that Nicholas's immense wealth had sucked him into a lonely, meaningless existence in which he had lost all sense of humanity, but participating in this game would help Nicholas see the light, rediscover the value of life, and become a better person. Well, given that Rey Rivera worked with people in the finance industry who were probably not all that dissimilar to Nicholas Van Orton, perhaps he had somehow gotten it into his mind that he was participating in a real-life version of a game like this. If you look at the lower annex roof of the conference room Rey crashed into, you'll notice that it contains a pair of see-through glass windows near the spot where the hole was. If Rey was suffering from delusional disorder, his mind could have become trapped in some elaborate fantasy in which he truly believed that if he leaped off the roof of the Belvedere Hotel and crashed through one of those windows, he would somehow land safely and experience the same type of epiphany as Nicholas Van Orton. It's a very intriguing theory, and this Reddit post has wound up capturing so much attention that it was even addressed during an interview in Entertainment Weekly with Terry Dunn Muir, one of the original co-creators of Unsolved Mysteries. Well, Muir said that she personally spoke to Allison about this theory, but Allison didn't place much significance in it because Rey liked a lot of different types of movies. According to Muir, quote, he kept so many journals full of random writing. Allison feels that she's been through all the journals just trying to find any clue that could help her figure out what happened to him, and she couldn't find any real strong connections to the game. End quote. Well, even if that's the case, that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't something else going on inside Rey's mind, which compelled him to leap to his death on his own. But before we delve any further into that, we have to look at all the possible angles. Even if you hold the position that there was no foul play here, and no one else was involved in Rey's death, there's still a number of odd discrepancies which have never been adequately explained. I mean, the last confirmed sighting of Rey while he was alive was him frantically sprinting out of his house after receiving a phone call and yelling out an expletive. Since no one has been able to determine what that call was about, you can understand why Rey's loved ones would automatically become suspicious. Quite frankly, if the person who made that call ever came forward and revealed what they said to Rey, that might take a lot of the mystery out of this case. But before I talk about the call itself, I think I should briefly address the house guest, Claudia, who is the only witness who can confirm this story. Claudia's full name has never been revealed publicly, and all we really know about her is that she was a business colleague of Allison's. Given that she was staying at the house while Allison was out of town on business, I have seen some suspicion directed towards Claudia from people online who wonder if there might be more to her story, and that perhaps she could have been having an affair with Rey. Well, Makita Brotman actually addresses this in her book, and acknowledges why it might be tempting to believe there was something secretive involving Claudia, but as far as Brotman can tell, there's no reason to doubt Claudia's version of events, or believe that she has any further role in this case. It's interesting how Claudia claims that shortly after Rey sprinted out of the house, she heard him briefly return before leaving again, but no one knows why. It's possible that he just simply forgot something, but part of me wonders if this is when he took the opportunity to tape the cryptic note behind his computer. Anyway, two of the main reasons people believe that Rey's employer played some sort of role in his death is because the final phone call supposedly originated from them, and the company allegedly implemented a gag order which prevented all the employees from talking about the case. But it's possible that neither of these claims might even be true. Unsolved Mysteries gave off the impression that Stansberry and Associates was behind the phone call, but that's a bit misleading since Rey no longer worked for Stansberry and was now doing freelance video work for the Oxford Club, another subsidiary company under the same umbrella network, Agora Incorporated. Unsolved Mysteries also did not mention that there was a total of 5 calls to Rey's number made through Agora's business line that day. While I don't believe the contents of the other calls have ever been revealed publicly, I'm willing to believe that most of them were nothing out of the ordinary and might have just involved routine, work-related stuff, as Rey was working on an important video project which had an upcoming deadline. Theories have been pushed forward that Rey was killed because he stumbled upon some incriminating information at his company which put his life in danger, or somebody wanted revenge against him because he had given out some bad stock tips through his financial newsletter, The Rebound Report, causing them to lose money. But this was around 6 to 7 months after Rey left Stansberry, and since he was primarily working as a videographer and filming conferences, I just don't get the impression that he was privy to much of the financial stuff taking place at the company at this time. The SEC lawsuit against Stansberry was filed over a year before Rey was hired to work for them, and tied up in litigation at the time of Rey's death, so even though he had written a newsletter for a while, it doesn't sound like Rey had any connection to that investigation. The additional complication are the comments from Colonel Fred Bielefeld, who originally stated that the final call to Rey came from the Fells Point neighborhood, which is a few miles away from Agora's offices, though other sources claim that the call came from one of Agora's subsidiary companies. Well, if no one associated with Agora made that call, then who did? And what could they have possibly said to make Rey react like this? So now we have to talk about Porter Stansberry himself, who has become a prominent enough figure in the finance world that both he and his company, Stansberry and Associates Investment Research, have their own Wikipedia pages. He declined to be interviewed for the Unsolved Mysteries segment, but in the days prior to this episode's release, Porter agreed to go on the record for an interview in the Baltimore Sun and defended himself against the insinuations put forward by the show. He maintained that in spite of the allegations that he refused to cooperate with the police, he did have a meeting on June the 23rd, 2006, with a homicide detective named Marvin Sidnor, who had taken over the case after Michael Bayer was reassigned. Porter also denies the allegations that there was a gag order against his employees, which prevented them from talking about the case. He said they were only advised to refer media inquiries to a company spokesperson. I was interested to learn that Porter was out of town at a corporate retreat on the day Rey went missing. In fact, according to Porter in his recent interview, all employees from Stansberry and Associates were at the same retreat, so none of them could have made the final phone call to Rey. Of course, some conspiracy theorists might say that Rey was conveniently out of town that day while someone else did his dirty work, but if he was not present in Baltimore that day, then I think this would rule out the possibility of him being the person who made that final phone call to Rey. It does sound like Porter was very proactive in the initial search effort, and I have actually seen copies of emails he sent out to his staff and his newsletter subscriber base in which he publicized Rey's disappearance and urged them to contact the authorities if they had any information. However, the one piece of new information I learned from the book, which took me by surprise, was that Rey had left Porter a voicemail on May the 14th, 2 days before he disappeared, in which he said, "Hey man, call me back. I finally got it all figured out." It's unclear if Porter ever did call Rey back, but he did willingly play this voicemail for Rey's family during the time period he was missing, and claimed to have no idea what Rey was talking about. Now, it's possible this voicemail has no significance to this case whatsoever, but if Porter was involved in Rey's death, it strikes me as odd that he would hold on to the voicemail for several days and tell Rey's family about it. I don't know about you, but I kind of take that as a sign that Porter legitimately had no clue what happened to Rey at this point, and was hoping his family might be able to provide him with some insight about the voicemail. And of course, the fact that no one knew what Rey was referring to when he said, "I finally got it all figured out," could be interpreted as another sign that there was something wrong with his mental state at that point, and perhaps he had figured out something which made no sense to anyone else but him. On the basis of how Unsolved Mysteries portrayed him, I got the impression that Porter completely cut himself off from Allison and everyone in Rey's family following the discovery of Rey's body, when in actuality, Allison visited him at his office, and Porter told her face-to-face that he would not speak to the police because of potential bias they might have against him over the SEC investigation. Yes, from a moral standpoint, you can definitely disagree with Porter's decision, since Rey was one of his closest friends, but from a legal standpoint, you can understand his logic. I mean, given his financial misdeeds, it's obvious that Porter Stansberry is not a saint, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's a murderer. Another reason people have expressed their suspicion towards Rey's employers is because it was his fellow co-workers who contacted the police after discovering the hole in the conference room where his body was located. I will admit, I can understand why people are suspicious of this part of the story, because even though they worked in the area, it seems like quite a coincidence that on a whim, these coworkers would just decide to search the upper level of this parking garage and happen to notice a hole and Ray's personal items on top of the lower annex roof. But it's also worth noting that these were not employees of Stansberry and Associates, but worked alongside Ray at the Oxford Club, so I'm not sure if these guys would have even known Porter Stansberry or been privy to any shady stuff that might have been going on at Agora. One of these co-workers, Mark Whistler, had only been working for the company for a very short time and claimed to have only met Ray on one previous occasion. The other co-worker, named Stephen King, had known Ray for about a year and actually agreed to be interviewed by Makita Brotman for her book, which does kind of go against the claims that a gag order had prevented Agora's employees from talking about the case. King actually concurs with the theory that Ray's death was not an intentional suicide, but may have been the result of a mental breakdown, as King claimed he had another friend who had to be hospitalized after suffering a traumatic event, which caused her to exhibit some of the same paranoid behavior that Ray seemed to be experiencing. So the co-workers' chance discovery of the hole on the roof may have actually been pure luck. The problem I have with the idea of Stansberry or anyone affiliated with them being responsible for Ray's death is that I just can't understand the logic of doing it in a busy downtown location such as the Belvedere Hotel. How could they have been so certain that they'd managed to kill him without showing up on any security camera footage? Yes, I know it does sound ominous that all the footage filmed on May the 16th was seemingly wiped out because of a quote-unquote technical problem, and the one camera on the rooftop happened to be disconnected that night. However, according to Makita Brotman, it was not uncommon for technical glitches, such as cameras not working, to frequently occur during this time period. And even though Agora Incorporated is a pretty big company, it's not like they own the Belvedere, so would they really have had enough influence to infiltrate the security system and erase all the incriminating evidence? It's been speculated that the scene with the hole on the lower annex roof was staged to make it look like Ray fell through there when he might have actually been killed elsewhere before his body was placed inside the conference room. But how would Ray's killers have accessed the room? When the police arrived at the scene, the concierge had to unlock the door to let them inside, so in order for this murder conspiracy to work, employees from the Belvedere would need to be in on it, and that just doesn't seem logical to me. I really don't see how else Ray could have entered that conference room without crashing through the ceiling. One theory which has been proposed to explain the discrepancies with the physics of Ray jumping off the main roof is that he was actually dropped into the conference room from a helicopter. But this idea has pretty much been discounted by anyone with knowledge of downtown Baltimore, as their airspace is subject to air traffic control, so there's no way a helicopter could have flown over that area and dropped a body without attracting any attention. Another theory I've seen is that Ray could have been hit by a car on the upper level of the adjacent parking garage, which propelled him off the edge and caused him to go flying 20 feet before he crashed through the lower annex roof. Being struck with a car would also account for why the Assistant State Medical Examiner, Dr. Brazel, supposedly believed that the injuries to Ray's shins were not consistent with a fall. However, this theory has pretty much been discounted as well, because the entire top level of that parking garage was surrounded by 4-foot walls, which would have blocked Ray's fall, or at least caused some serious structural damage if he was hit by a vehicle. This also would have made it impossible for Ray to leap the full 20 feet off the upper level on his own, as the walls would have prevented him from getting a running start before he made the jump. And I should once again reiterate that the sole source of Dr. Brazel's comment about Ray's shins is Allison during her Unsolved Mysteries interview, and I do not believe Brazel has ever confirmed this detail herself. The original autopsy report specifically states, quote, "A 2-inch by 7-inch abrasion was on the interior aspect of the lower right leg, with associated open fracture of the tibia and fibula, with protrusion of bone through a 4-inch by 6-inch laceration," end quote. There is no mention at all of any injuries to Ray's left leg, so I'm not sure why Allison is referring to his shins. one of the biggest points which has been used to dispute the idea of Rey's death being a fall from a high place are his glasses and cell phone being found near the hole, relatively unscathed. This has led to speculation that the items were planted there after Rey was murdered, but I think this could be explained by the fact that Rey may have dropped his phone and his glasses a short distance before he crashed through the roof, which is going to leave less damage than if they had fallen from 14 stories up. If Rey had his glasses and phone with him when he landed in the conference room, then the damage might have been a lot more severe. Yes, it might seem unlikely that someone could sprint 11 miles per hour and make a running leap of 43 feet, but Rey was a very athletic guy who had once been a skilled water polo player, so perhaps he was capable of a jump like that. Overall, it's definitely a lot more plausible than the idea of someone else throwing Rey's body 43 feet, or him falling that distance accidentally. All that being said, there are still a number of unanswered questions here. One issue is that we don't know the exact time of Rey's death. We know Rey sprinted out of his house at 6:30 p.m., and Makita Brotman said she heard a loud crash outside her bedroom window at around 10 o'clock. Assuming that was the sound of Rey leaping off a roof, that's a 3.5-hour window of time in which his whereabouts are unaccounted for. While he parked Allison's SUV in a nearby lot at some point that night, we still don't know Rey's reasons for going to the Belvedere. When he originally left the house, did he always plan on going there? Or did something else happen which prompted him to make the decision to take his own life? That unaccounted for time might also be the reason that the money clip Allison gave Rey as her wedding gift was not found anywhere near his body, even though he always carried it on him. Allison said she searched the SUV and couldn't find it there either, but since we don't know Rey's exact movements, he easily could have dropped it somewhere before or after he arrived at the Belvedere. For all we know, someone else could have found the money clip and kept it, not realizing that it was a potentially important piece of evidence in a police investigation. This doesn't necessarily mean someone murdered Rey and decided to keep the money clip as a memento. But putting all this aside, would Rey have been capable of navigating his way to the Belvedere roof to begin with? And if he did, how did he manage to do so without being seen? Well, this is one area in which the book about this case is an invaluable source of information, since Makita Brotman lives at the Belvedere and is very knowledgeable about the layout. She claims to have personally climbed out onto the main roof herself, and knows the exact route one would have to take in order to get there. I mentioned earlier that you could only reach the roof by climbing up a ladder inside an attic, which is only accessible via 2 separate doors. One is in a service area next to the 12th floor kitchens, and the other is a door at the back of the 13th floor nightclub. And apparently, it was not uncommon for the nightclub's bartenders to go up onto the floor for smoke breaks and leave this door unlocked. But it sounds like you would need to have some familiarity with the Belvedere to even know that these doors and the attic existed. The original police report is available for viewing online, and it states, quote, "It was also determined that this roof was accessible, and the victim had frequented the hotel on several occasions in the past," end quote. That statement is pretty vague, but according to Allison, she recalled frequenting the Belvedere's Owl Bar on at least 2 occasions with Rey, though this bar is located on the 1st floor, and she does not have any recollection of Rey ever having visited the 13th floor nightclub. But of course, Rey lived in Baltimore on his own for several months before Allison moved there from California to join him, so it's possible that he could have visited the nightclub without her. After all, the Belvedere is in very close proximity to his workplace, so it would have been an ideal place for them to hold work-related functions and get-togethers. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit report also has an interesting line which states, quote, "Rivera frequented the Belvedere Hotel with family and friends. 2 bartenders at the hotel knew him, but did not see him the night of his disappearance," end quote. Well, that statement is also disappointingly vague, as I'd like to know how well these bartenders knew Rey. If they were friends, then they may have told him about how often they used an access door behind the nightclub to go up to the roof to take smoke breaks, which would explain how Rey knew about the door. However, in 2006, The same staff worked at both the Owl Bar and the 13th floor, and since it was confirmed that Rey frequented the Owl Bar, for all we know, he knew the bartenders from there and never visited the nightclub. Even though it was still called the Belvedere Hotel, we cannot forget that it housed condominiums at this point, and while certain areas of the building were open to the public, I'm not sure it's the type of place where an outsider could wander around freely without attracting attention. In fact, according to Makita Brotman, a resident's keycard was required to use the building's elevators, and it would have to be unlocked by a concierge in order to go any higher than the 10th floor. However, Brotman also acknowledges that in 2006, it was not uncommon for the elevators to be left unlocked. And again, if it would have been this difficult for Rey to access the roof on his own, think about how much more difficult it would have been for other people to go up there with him to commit murder and then make it all the way back down again without attracting attention. I know there have been some questions with the physics and whether or not it would have been possible for Rey to leap so far that he landed at a spot 43 feet away from the building, but given the severe nature of his injuries, I just cannot think of another way he could have ended up in that conference room besides a fall from a great height. If he didn't leap off the roof, maybe there was some other spot from the building he could have jumped from, which everyone has overlooked. However, here's one more piece of information which could potentially change everything. When Rey exited the house and left his computer running, he had a website open which showed what time the sun would set in Baltimore that day. While this has never been officially confirmed publicly, rumors have circulated that Allison admitted to police that she and Rey once went up to the roof of the Belvedere in order to watch the sunset. If this is actually true, it not only provides a potential explanation for how Rey might have found his way to the roof, but why he chose to go to that spot to begin with. Anyway, to fully understand the circumstances of how Rey died, we have to explore his mental health again, and I'm going to briefly discuss another tragic case which took place at a hotel. I'm sure that many of you know that over the past several years, one of the most highly discussed cases online is the death of Eliza Lamb, whose nude body was found dead inside a water tank on the roof of Los Angeles' Cecil Hotel in 2013. You can see a number of parallels with Rey's case, but the key difference is that there was security camera footage of Eliza acting strangely in the hotel elevator prior to her death. Of course, once this video was released online and went viral, the whole story was blown way out of proportion, with a lot of speculation that something paranormal was causing Eliza to behave that way. But in actuality, Eliza had a history of bipolar disorder, so the commonly accepted explanation is that she had a psychotic episode which prompted her to remove her clothing and climb into the water tank on her own, which led to her drowning. Now, we know Rey Rivera did not have any documented history of bipolar disorder or any other mental illness, but think of it this way. If there had been any existing security footage of Rey in the Belvedere that night, and it showed him acting erratically and exhibiting some of the same behavior as Eliza Lamb, how differently would people view this case? One of the main reasons Rey's loved ones believe he was being targeted for murder was because the burglar alarm went off at his home right before his disappearance, and he apparently looked terrified. I know it might seem like quite a coincidence that this happened to take place shortly before his death, but if Rey was suffering from paranoid delusions, the incident could have exasperated them. I'm not sure I buy the explanation that squirrels set off the alarm, but perhaps it was just a failed attempt at a random burglary and the perpetrator ran off when they heard the alarm. However, this could have wound up convincing Rey that someone was after him. In regards to the cryptic note Rey left behind, I've seen a number of people state online that they have similar stream of consciousness writing styles to Rey, where they will just jot down whatever's in their minds on paper, and the end result might not make much sense to outsiders. They've even joked that if they were ever to go missing or wind up dead, people could easily look at their writings and make the mistaken assumption that they were mentally ill or attempting to share a coded message. That's a valid point, but if Rey did not believe the note had any significance, why would he go to the trouble of wrapping it in plastic and placing it behind a computer next to a blank check from his production company? The moment this episode was released, Unsolved Mysteries fans were immediately making comparisons to the Chuck Morgan case, which is one of the all-time most memorable segments in the history of the show, and was also covered on an episode of The Trail Went Cold. Chuck Morgan was the victim of a very suspicious death, which was ruled a suicide, even though he was shot in the back of the head, and a $2 bill would be found inside his underwear, which had some cryptic writing on it that some people believed was a coded message. But unlike the cryptic message in the Morgan case, Ray's note was analyzed by the FBI, and they were inclined to believe that it showed signs that he was suffering from some sort of mental illness. So it's possible there is no coded message inside that note, and if there is, it would not make sense to anyone but Ray. Now, perhaps I'm reading too much into things, but here's another potential theory I came up with after looking at Ray's note, which is a bit similar to the theory involving the movie, The Game. We know that Ray was a huge film buff, but there's one section of the note where he wrote, quote, and specifically, let me say that I expect M. Night Shyamalan to continue coming up with great ideas and making great movies. I certainly enjoyed his movies, end quote. Well, if you're not familiar with him, M. Night Shyamalan is a very prominent director, and no, he did not continue to make great movies beyond 2006, but that's beside the point. In the note, Ray listed all the movies Shyamalan had made up until that point, and one of them was the 2000 film Unbreakable. The plot in that one involves a character played by Bruce Willis who survives a deadly train crash which kills all the other passengers, yet he somehow does not receive any scratches or injuries. This eventually leads to Willis discovering that he is a superhero who has extraordinary abilities and is practically invincible. What if Ray had somehow gotten it into his head that he had developed these same superhuman abilities which would allow him to survive a leap off the roof of a tall building? Of course, this is all just speculation on my part, and there's no evidence to support this, but after looking at that note, you can come up with any number of theories to attempt to explain why he would have done something like this. Look, I can definitely understand why Ray's loved ones would believe that he was the victim of foul play and dismiss the suicide theory. Even if they missed all the signs that he was suicidal, there's no logical reason for him to be up on the roof of the Belvedere Hotel, as there are much easier ways to end one's life than navigating your way to the top of a labyrinthian building. But there are also much easier ways to end your life than traveling 1,500 miles to another state, yet that's exactly what Gail Delano did. You can just never know what's really going on inside the mind of a person who's suicidal or suffering through some sort of serious mental health issues, such as a psychotic breakdown. If there was no one else involved in Ray's death, then it will be impossible to receive conclusive answers about what happened. However, I can definitely understand the pain and frustration that Allison and the rest of Ray's family must feel. In addition to the trauma and grief surrounding Ray's death, Allison was also responsible for paying off around $90,000 in debt he had left behind. A portion of it was from Ray's purchase of the equipment for his new production company, but about $70,000 of that money was expenses Ray had incurred from having attended and filmed the Oxford Club's conference, and it was all put on Allison's credit card. Ray was supposed to be reimbursed all that money by Agora once he turned in the video, but unfortunately, the police kept the video as evidence for 90 days following his death, so by the time Allison was able to turn the tape over to the company, they had no use for it, since the investment information shared at the conference was now outdated. So Allison would not be reimbursed anything and had to single-handedly pay off the $90,000 debt on her card, which took years, and I'm sure no one wants to believe that the person they loved left them in such a precarious position. By the sound of things, the case is pretty much in limbo right now, because even though Dr. Brazel classifying Ray's death as undetermined means that the case is technically not closed, it really does not help things too much. If the death was officially ruled to be a homicide, the Baltimore PD would have to put time and resources into investigating it, but they have no real obligation to do so under these circumstances. But remember, just because a medical examiner classifies a death as undetermined does not mean they personally believe the victim was murdered. The autopsy report specifically states that Ray's injuries were consistent with someone who suffered a fall from a great height, but they just could not determine how he fell from this height, which is why his death couldn't be classified as a homicide or a suicide. To put this into perspective, in 2006, 13% of the deaths which took place in Baltimore were categorized as homicides, and 8% were suicides, but 20% were undetermined. However, it does sound like one of the biggest problems is that the police showed up to the scene with the automatic assumption that Rey's death was a suicide. If they had performed a more thorough investigation, they may still have arrived at the same conclusion, but at least due diligence would have been done, and there would be fewer unanswered questions. According to Makita Brotman's first-hand account, the crime scene at the Belvedere was hardly secured, as a battalion of police cadets were brought into the conference room to view Rey's body as part of a training exercise. Within hours of his body being removed, Brotman claimed that she and some other residents were able to freely enter the conference room, which had been left unlocked, and the police never canvassed the building or performed any interviews to ask residents if they saw or heard anything unusual. So if by chance this was a homicide, I can see how crucial evidence might have been overlooked or destroyed. I fully admit that I don't have the answers to explain all the bizarre discrepancies in this case, but when you take everything into account, I still think the idea of Rey jumping off the building on his own accord makes more sense than the idea of him being the victim of foul play. I honestly think that some of the answers might lie in that final phone call Rey received before he went missing. It's still up for debate whether or not the call was made by someone at Rey's workplace, but without knowing its contents, I can see why Rey's loved ones would continue to assume that something shady might have happened which paved the way for his death. So no matter who they are, I really wish this caller would come forward and possibly provide Rey's wife and family with some answers. Like I said earlier, if there was no murder conspiracy, and the decision was made by Rey and Rey alone to end his life, then there's just no possible way for his loved ones to receive any answers, and that is just a very tough thing for a bereaved person to live with. I still believe this was an ideal case to select for the very first episode of the new Unsolved Mysteries reboot, because it is a very compelling mystery, but you cannot deny that they twisted the facts in order to add more ambiguity to certain aspects of the story. In the end, it's possible that this whole thing was just a big tragedy brought on by some undiagnosed mental illness, and there is no crime to solve. All that being said, if you happen to have any information to suggest that Rey Rivera's death might actually be foul play, or you have some more conclusive answers about what happened, please contact the appropriate authorities, or send in a tip through the official Unsolved Mysteries website at unsolved.com. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produce a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, I released an episode about my top 10 favorite update segments from Unsolved Mysteries where cases were solved. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Robert S., Alyssa N., Yvonne Y., Kim, and Linda I. Thank you all so much for your support. And before we bring this episode to a close, I'd like to play a promo for a soon-to-be-released new podcast from Laura Norton, one of the creators of the Fall Line podcast. This one is titled One Strange Thing. Have a listen.
We all enjoy a little mystery. And on the new podcast, One Strange Thing, that's just what you'll get. Every other week, One Strange Thing presents forgotten stories from America's news archives. They all have something in common, a single element that can't quite be explained. I'm Laura Norton. Join me on One Strange Thing, and you'll hear about bizarre events that unfolded in our country's local newspapers, but never made it much further than that. No matter the place or the people, One Strange Thing brings you stories that are very real and just a little otherworldly. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
And since Unsolved Mysteries was such a big part of this episode, I also wanted to announce that this coming Saturday, August the 15th, we will be having yet another Unsolved Mysteries live watch together marathon at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We've already had a couple of these in the past, but how these work is that we screen classic segments from Unsolved Mysteries about cases which were featured on The Trail Went Cold, and while you watch them, you can chat with myself and your fellow listeners. All you have to do to join us is click on the link to the screening room, which I will be providing in the show notes, and you can also find the link pinned to the top of our podcast Facebook and Twitter pages. So once again, our Unsolved Mysteries Marathon will take place this coming Saturday, August the 15th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and we hope to see you there. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, both of which provide a number of interesting threads and discussions about this case. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.